Her belly was the size of a basketball in the recovery room. The only problem was she didn't have surgery on her belly. You want to know what this is all about and why this woman's belly was inflating like a basketball in the recovery room? Come join me on this walk through the neighborhood as I share with you through social distancing exactly what happened to this woman and why it was all because a nurse was careless. Hi, I'm Gerry Oginski. I'm a New York medical malpractice and personal injury attorney. Come join me on this walk through the neighborhood today and here in Great Neck. It's a gorgeous day today, and I wanted to share a couple of interesting stories with you about cases that I've handled to give you an insight into how these types of cases work. All right, so now what happened? This woman had surgery. The surgery went great. There were no complications. There was very little blood loss, no problem whatsoever. Now they bring her into the recovery room. In the recovery room, within about 10 minutes, this woman started waking up from anesthesia and she started screaming. Why was she screaming? She was screaming because her belly looked like it was inflating. It looked like it was inflating faster than you can inflate a basketball, faster than you can inflate a little rubber ball. And what was the big deal? The big deal was this woman didn't have surgery on her belly. This woman went in for a procedure on her knee. In fact, she went in for a knee replacement. And that surgery went great. Now, in the recovery room, the nurses are watching her screaming. She's in agony. Her belly's getting bigger and bigger and bigger by the moment. And the nurses can't figure out why her belly is behaving this way. So the nurses call the doctor. The doctor who just performed the procedure, I believe, was in surgery, so he wasn't available. So they called one of the doctors in training, one of the resident orthopedists. Now, what happens? He comes in, he looks at her. He can't figure out why this woman's belly is inflating. So what does he do? He calls in another surgeon to come and evaluate. And now he evaluates her and he examines her head to toe and can't figure out why this woman is having a belly that's inflating. There's no possible reason why this should be occurring. Why? Because this woman had surgery for her knee. Now, you should know, and I'll give you a little heads up here. At the end of the knee surgery, the doctor, the orthopedic surgeon, had told the nurses what he wanted done in the recovery room. He said, listen, I put a little drain in the patient's knee, so if there is any fluid, I want that fluid drained out. Okay? These are normal routine instructions that any doctor, any orthopedic surgeon will tell the recovery room staff to be done. Simple enough. So now the surgeons can't figure out why her belly is inflating. They make a decision to take this patient to the operating room again within half an hour after coming out of the operating room for her knee. And you know what they do? They put her under emergency general anesthesia. And now, what do? The surgeon takes the knife, takes the scalpel, and begins cutting all the way from the top of her belly, right under her rib cage, and now cuts all the way down to her groin. And as he does that, something remarkable happens. He hears this hiss, this whoosh of air come out when he makes that incision into her belly. It's like psh, it's like deflating a ball. And now they have to find the source of where this air came from, because clearly to them, this woman had air in her belly. And now the sound of this whooshing that now escaped once they cut open her belly confirmed the fact that there was air coming from somewhere. So the first place they began to look was her intestines. And they did something called running the bowel, which means they now have to inspect her entire intestine, the entire length of her intestines, inch by inch, to try and identify where is there a hole, where is there perforation, what just happened, where did this air come from? And now, after spending a considerable amount of time doing that, you know what they found? Absolutely nothing. They found absolutely nothing. The intestines were perfectly normal. This was a 60-plus-year-old woman, and now she had never had an abdominal surgery. She never had any surgery before this surgery to her knee. And now here she is with two surgeons poking around her abdomen with her belly filleted open. And now they're trying to find out where the air came from. And you know what? They can't figure it out. They have no idea where the air came from. Hang on, let me just grab a little bit of water and I will continue and I'll tell you where the air came from. Okay, so the surgeons, after looking around, came to the conclusion that they still had no idea where the air came from. What did they do? They closed the patient up. Imagine that. They thought that this woman had a problem. They did the right thing by taking her to the operating room, emergently opening up her belly, and then trying to search for the source of that air. Unfortunately, they couldn't find it. So they closed her up, and now, while the patient is in the recovery room, they began to retrace the steps of this patient, and they began talking to every nurse who interacted and had any contact with the patient whatsoever. It turned out that after about 45 minutes of talking to each nurse who had contact with the patient, they finally came to the conclusion of what had happened. And you know what it was? It was carelessness. That's what it was. One of the nurses who was setting up this patient after she came out of the operating room, remember I told you that the patient had a drain? This drain was to be attached to a suction device. And how do you do that? You take a piece of tubing, attach it to the drain coming out of the patient's knee, take that tubing and then attach it to the wall which says suction. And then you turn the valve on, and now air is sucked out of the drain and any fluid will come with it. That's what was supposed to happen. Instead, these two surgeons found out exactly what was done. You know why? Because they asked the nurse to recreate step by step exactly what she had done. And it turned out she didn't do what she was told to do. She didn't do what she'd been trained to do. She didn't follow the protocol. And what was the protocol? To attach the drain to tubing, to then take that tubing and attach it to a suction outlet on the wall and turn on the valve and observe that air or fluid is coming into that device on the wall. Instead, what happened here was that this woman attached this tubing to an oxygen outlet valve, and then turned the valve on. So instead of pulling any air and fluid out of this patient's knee, what did she do? She now forced oxygen into the patient's knee compartment, which is a sealed, closed compartment that never should have been getting air. So now you have air being forced into this closed compartment, and there's no place for it to go. So where does it go? Just like with water going downhill, it's going to find the weakest place possible to go. Now the air gets pushed under the skin, and it starts in the knee compartment. And from there, it goes up the knee, up to the thigh. And now, from there, it goes up to the groin. And now, from there, it continues because the oxygen is still on, and now it goes up to her belly. And now, there was no air being pumped actually into her belly, but it's right under the skin. The doctors call this crepitus, C-R-E-P-I-T-U-S. And that, if they bothered to put their fingers on the patient's belly, they would have felt this crackling sound. You feel it. You feel that there's some air right under the skin. But they didn't recognize where that had come from. So that prompted them to take the patient back to the operating room. So here, this patient needed an unnecessary surgery, immediate emergency surgery with immediate anesthesia again. She needed to be opened up from the top of her rib cage all the way down to her groin in an emergency effort to try and find out what was going on. These doctors fished around in there for over an hour to try and identify the source of her air in her belly. And it turns out it wasn't in her belly. It was under the skin. And then this patient needed to be in the hospital for almost a week to recuperate when she had planned to go home after a couple of hours from the successful knee surgery. But not so in this case. So, why do I share this with you? Oh, wait, I didn't even tell you the best part. The best part about this is that the nurses and the hospitals failed to accept responsibility for what had occurred. How do you like that? In fact, it was so disgusting. So here's what happened. After the patient gets home, a few months later, after she's recuperated, she reaches out to me and asks me to investigate. We go ahead and ultimately, after having the case reviewed by a medical expert who confirms that there were clear violations from good and accepted medical care, we went ahead and started a lawsuit on her behalf. The hospital and the nurses refused to accept responsibility for what had occurred here. They fought us tooth and nail for over 2 years, denying that they did anything wrong. How outrageous is that? It was clear cut to everybody who read this case. It was clear cut to every single person. So now, during the course of this patient's lawsuit, I had an opportunity to question the nurse who was involved in this total screw-up. And you know what? She was so defiant. It was horrible. This is not what nurses are trained to do. This is not what nurses are supposed to do. Nurses, we rely on them. The doctors rely on them each and every day. And they're great, they're wonderful. Except in this case, they weren't. And now this particular nurse turned around and had the nerve to say, I did everything right. I did everything according to hospital protocol. And I said to her, you mean when the doctor tells you to attach this tubing, this drain to suction, it's appropriate and acceptable to attach it to an oxygen output device? And the answer I got was total gibberish. It was total nonsense. And after that deposition, that question and answer session that was given in the hospital attorney's office, in the hospital attorney's conference room, the hospital approached us and attempted to begin negotiations, which ultimately we were able to do. We were able to settle the case. But I share this with you, I share this particular story with you, just to give you a sense of what actually happens and what the doctors and the hospitals actually do to deny taking responsibility when it was so clear-cut to everybody involved here. Let me share another quick story with you to give you another sense of what happened involving a patient who was in the intensive care unit. She had just had significant surgery, and the surgery was fine, went fine. And everything in the ICU up until this moment that I'm going to share with you was done appropriately, and we had no issue with that whatsoever. So what's the problem, you say? The problem occurred when the nurse recognized that the patient's alarm, one of the monitors, was going off. So being that she was busy, she went ahead and went over and reset the alarm. And then about a minute later, the alarm triggered again. And what did she do? She went to go ahead and restart the machine. And then 30 seconds later, the alarm went off again. And she starts fiddling with it, then she resets it, then she plays around with the settings. Now she's trying to adjust it. She's adjusting the monitor, she's adjusting the settings, she's taking it out, restarting the power. And this goes on for about, I don't know, maybe 7-8 minutes, maybe even more. Until finally, she turns her attention away from the monitor that had been continuing to blare and looks at the patient. And you know what she finds? The patient was in full cardiac arrest. The patient was not breathing. The patient had no heart rate, no respirations. So now she finally calls a code. And at this point, doctors all come running. And now they do their best to try and revive her and resuscitate her. Hey, Madison, nice to see you. You're going through that right now, car accident? I'm sorry to hear that. So now what happens? So now they try and revive her, but guess what? This woman had lost so much oxygen, she had a condition, she had hypoxia, which is a total lack of oxygen. And because she had gone without oxygen for such a significant amount of time, this patient ultimately became brain damaged, brain dead, and died a few days later. And so the family reached out to me a few months later, asked me to investigate because they had questions and concerns about their family member who had just died. And we went ahead and investigated, got all the medical records, and had a medical expert confirm that in fact there were clear violations from the standard of care. It turned out that this nurse never should have putzed around, playing around with resetting the machine. She should have paid attention to the patient and recognized that it was the patient who needed to be restarted. The patient had a significant problem, and the machine was doing the correct thing, which was to alert the caregiver, to alert the nurse, to alert the doctor that there was a problem here. But instead, this nurse believed that it was the machinery that was at fault, the machinery that was not working properly, without paying any attention to the patient. And that was a significant problem. And it was our argument that if she had bothered paying attention to the patient at the appropriate time when the monitor first became triggered, that now resuscitating the patient would have had a significantly better opportunity to have survived that episode and lost the opportunity to do so. Why? Because she delayed for many, many minutes to the point where this patient suffered a significant lack of oxygen, causing her brain damage, brain death, and ultimately this patient's death. So why do I share this with you? I share it with you just to give you a sense of what really happened in 2 cases here in New York, and what we do as attorneys when we evaluate and try and help the family members, try and help the patients who suffer these injuries because of someone who is careless in the hospital. You know, I realize you're likely watching this video because it came up in your news feed, and now you're trying to figure out what these stories are all about. And even if this doesn't concern you right now, if you are watching this because you do have questions about your matter that happened here in New York, and you have not yet started a lawsuit, and this is important, it does not involve any care and treatment during this pandemic. This is the critical point I want to make here. If you have questions about your matter, and it does not involve any issues surrounding the pandemic medical care and treatment, but happened before the pandemic occurred, and still have questions that occurred here in New York, what I invite you to do is pick up the phone and call me. You know, I answer questions like yours every single day, and I'd love to chat with you. You can reach me at 516-487-8207, or by email at Gerry, Gerry, at Oginski-law.com. Well, that's it for today's video. I'm Gerry Oginski. Have a wonderful day. Hey, Richie.